Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is Professor Guy Standing from the University of Bath. Guy is an economist by training, who spent a lot of time at the International Labor Organization in Geneva with their security program, and he's done a lot of great work over there. He was here a couple of years ago talking about his book on occupational citizenship, which was terrific and really we had a great conversation. He was good enough to come back today to talk about his new book, which is extremely timely, called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. So welcome, Guy, Chapel Hill.
Thanks very much.
How do I turn that off? Well, it's very nice to be invited back. It's particularly nice to be invited back when you've already been here stirring the thoughts. I've just written this book called The Precariat, and I finished it at the end of last year, and it's proved incredibly timely because of all the events that have been taking place this year. And a number of journalists have contacted me and said, well, you know, did you predict all these things? And there is one chapter predicting that if the precariat continues to be ignored, then we're going to see what I call days of rage and the continuation of a stage of primitive rebels, a phrase used by Eric Hobsbawm, as some of you will know, to describe people who, in an early point of a transformation, are rebelling against things they dislike, but don't yet know what they stand for. And it's that context, I think, that gives the book a certain topicality, shall we put it that way. Now, I'm going to do a presentation of the key themes of the book. And in doing so, I'm going to simplify on each of them. And I hope you will bear with me. I thought it better to give you the sort of narrative of the book, even though it risks some simplification as I do so. The book poses 5 questions and tries to answer them. The 5 questions are: what is the precariat? Why care about it? Why is it growing? Who is in the precariat? And where is it taking us as societies? Now, the precariat debates in Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, have been growing for the last few years. So the topicality there and the resonance of these debates is very powerful. If I talk to a group in Italy, for example, in Rome or anything, all the young people know what it's all about. What is exciting now is that the debate is moving across the Atlantic and found in Japan, it's found in Korea, it's found in a number of other countries. And I was particularly delighted, as you can all well imagine, to receive an email from Noam Chomsky about it. And he's actually started to refer to it in a number of his speeches, as he told me he was going to do so. So it has a certain resonance going around the world. So the first question is, what is it? Well, there are 2 ways of thinking of it. One is to think of Weberian ideal types. So your groups, your modal types. You're either in it or you're not in it. Another way is to think of a process of precariatization, a process in which the modal characteristics and trends of attitudes and experiences are affecting a growing number of people. Now, I'm going to concentrate on the first, but bear in mind the second as well. The point is that globalization ushered in a process of global class fragmentation. We have seen gradually superimposed on old class structures the formation of a class structure that is very peculiar to a globalized market system. At the top, you have an elite of disgustingly affluent people. They're not the 1%ers, they're the 0.01%. the billionaires, the multi-billionaires who just don't know where their money ends. It just multiplies. The famous expression of Mitterrand, if you remember, their money multiplies as they sleep. And these people are global citizens. They affect all of us. We know their names. We even know many of their crimes. They're people that are outside society. A long way below them is a growing, but actually threatened, salariat. People who have long-term employment security, they have the trappings of that, the enterprise benefits, the paid pensions, etc., etc., but their numbers are actually beginning to shrink. And alongside, in terms of income, is a growing number of people that I call proficients, combination of professional and technicians, people who are project-oriented in their life. They don't want employment security. They have bundles of competencies. They straddle the world. They live in electronically charged systems. They network. Don't feel too sorry for them, except that they risk burnout at age 31 and a half or something like that. Those people are growing and are increasingly influential. Below that, in terms of income, is a rapidly shrinking old working class that Andre Gors some years ago declared as dead, but has been shrinking all over the world. And the welfare states and the labor regulations and the International Labour Organization and all the 20th century trappings of laborism were essentially built for that class. They were built for that class, and yet we see it shrinking everywhere. It's not the future. It is clinging on. And as it clings on, more of them are being pushed down into the precariat. And I'll come to the definition in a minute. And below the precariat are the unemployed and a lumpenized underclass. I call a lumpen precariat. And it's very important to distinguish between the precariat and an underclass. The precariat is not an underclass, because it was wanted and is wanted by global capitalism. Whereas an underclass is a drag on accumulation, the precariat is a form of exploitation that is very specific to global capitalism. Now, if we think of the precariat in definitional terms, then we can say that it is at this moment a class in the making, not yet a Marxian class for itself. It experiences many common features, many insecurities, and a growing consciousness of that insecurity, but does not yet have a vision of common class consciousness to move forward. Now we think of them, and I found this particularly useful, as denizens, not citizens. A denizen is somebody who has a more restricted range of rights than a citizen. It's an ancient Roman term that was used also in the 13th century in England, where a person was granted a more limited range of rights for a limited time, etc. And increasingly, for various reasons, not just because of migrant status, but for various other reasons, more and more people are being converted into denizens. We have a limited range of rights. Now, most people would think of the precariat in terms of access to short-term, casual, low-paid jobs, in and out, flitting between activities. And that is part of the nature of the precariat. It is expected to be infinitely flexible. Increasingly, it is expected to do many forms of work for labor that are not recognized as labor. It is part of its existence as a growing group. That part is definitely true. But it also lacks all the 7 forms of labor security, which I document in this book and in the previous book that Arne mentioned, the 7 forms of labor security that were the agenda of the proletariat and trades unionism in the 20th century. They don't have agency, they don't have employment security, they don't have job security, they don't have income security, they don't have skill security, and they don't have labor market security. So they have different varieties and different degrees of insecurity, but essentially their life is one of insecurity. But the key definition for me, and I think this does resonate with a large number, particularly of the young people who are entering the precariat, is there is no sense of occupational identity. People in the precariat do not feel that they are in control of an occupational narrative for their life. I am not becoming something. I am not something. And this sense of lacking an occupational identity relates in part to that wonderful expression that Hannah Arendt used about the need for a social memory. People do not feel they belong to an occupational community where the ethics and standards and values have been handed down from generation to generation. They do not have that ethics, and therefore they are induced to be opportunistic in their behavior. I meet you today, you meet me today, we're never going to meet again, so we can be opportunistic to each other. Which leads to the point that there is no shadow of the future hanging over the relationships we have with other people. I'm not going to meet you again so I can take advantage of you. If there's a shadow of the future, then we're going to be showing reciprocity, solidarity, altruism, all those empathy, all those incredibly important things that make for a civilized existence. In the end, people in the precariat feel they belong to that famous expression of a lonely crowd. But there are also, and the final point on the question is that there are at this moment varieties of precariat. There are, first of all, those people who are falling out of working class communities and traditions, whose parents were, in the working class, and do not feel that they are, and they're falling down into something else. They tend to be relatively uneducated. They tend to be very easily led astray because of that and because of their insecurities, and are quite different from the other two categories that I think should be highlighted. The second one, of course, are those people who go into the precariat instrumentally. What they had before was worse, and so they put up, often the migrants. They keep their heads down. This is better than what I had before, so they don't actually aspire to have that occupational identity. It's good enough that they've come from a much worse background. And then there's the third group that's entering the precariat in growing numbers, which consists predominantly of educated, young, progressive people who've actually been taught through their experience to aspire for an occupational identity and a rich life of culture. Now, these three groups are very distinctive, and I'll come back to that at the end. Second question is, why care? Well, quite clearly, the obvious reason is that anybody in the precariat is vulnerable to extreme marginalization. You can very easily fall out of a precariat type of existence into something that's even worse. And there's the famous case, but you could apply it to men as well as to women, of the bag lady syndrome. People who wake up at night and are so fearful of one accident resulting in them losing everything and being out in the street with 2 paper bags for all their belongings. But the precariat experience 4 A's. The first one is anxiety, not surprisingly, but with globalization and the global market system, increasingly people are subject to economic uncertainty. Unknown unknowns, that famous Rumsfeldian term, but it's very applicable because you can't insure against many of the risks and the hazards and the shocks that affect the people in the precariat. They cannot face a system of security because they're not offered one. And second, A, is Durkheimian anomie. Because increasingly there is a despair of escape from being in the precariat. Once you're in it, the chances of you actually escaping it over the next 20, 30, 40